The morning sky bled crimson over the abandoned city of Millhaven, but Kaelin Ashworth knew it wasn't the sun painting those violent streaks across the horizon. Smoke rose from a dozen different fires, each one marking another fallen refuge, another group of survivors who hadn't made it through the night. He crouched behind the rusted hulk of an overturned bus, his weathered hands gripping a makeshift spear crafted from a broken street sign and kitchen knife. The metal felt cold against his palms, a stark reminder of how far humanity had fallen in just 3 months. The infection had started in the research facilities on the outskirts of town, or so the final radio broadcasts had claimed before the airwaves went silent forever. Dr. Ixera Hollowan, one of the few scientists who had escaped the initial outbreak, called it the Lazarus strain, a pathogen that rewrote the fundamental architecture of death itself. The infected didn't simply die, they returned as something else entirely, driven by an insatiable hunger that could only be satisfied by the flesh of the living. Kaelin heard the familiar shuffling footsteps approaching from the west. 3 of them, maybe 4, their movements erratic and predatory. He had learned to distinguish the sounds over the past weeks, the wet dragging of feet that no longer felt pain, the guttural moans that escaped from throats that should have been silent forever. The undead moved differently in groups, almost as if they communicated through some primitive network that science couldn't explain. Behind him, huddled in the hollow belly of the bus, 7 other survivors waited in terrified silence. Zara Nightingale, a former emergency room nurse whose steady hands had saved more lives than she could count, clutched a medical bag filled with rapidly dwindling supplies. Her dark eyes reflected a mixture of determination and barely contained despair. Beside her, young Naya Sweetwater, barely 16, held a photograph of her family, the edges worn soft from constant touching. The girl had witnessed horrors that would break most adults, yet somehow maintained a spark of hope that amazed everyone who knew her. Thorne Blackridge, a decorated army sergeant whose unit had been decimated in the first wave of attacks, methodically checked his ammunition for the 100th time that morning. His jaw was set in the grim line of a man who had seen too much death, who carried the weight of every soldier he couldn't save. The military's attempts to contain the outbreak had failed spectacularly, but Thorne's tactical knowledge had kept their small group alive when larger, better-equipped teams had fallen. The other survivors included Ember Ravencrest, a former construction worker whose knowledge of the city's infrastructure had proven invaluable, Voss Grimwald, a businessman whose moral compass seemed to shift depending on the circumstances, and Dr. Ixera herself, whose guilt over her role in the outbreak's origins drove her to seek redemption through helping others survive. As the undead drew closer, Kaelin made a silent gesture to his companions. They had practiced this routine countless times, a coordinated retreat through the bus's rear emergency exit, followed by a carefully planned route through the abandoned shopping district. Survival had become a brutal arithmetic of conserving energy, avoiding confrontation, and always staying ahead of the growing hordes. The first infected appeared around the bus's front end, its movements jerky and unnatural. Once, it might have been a middle-aged woman, perhaps a teacher or office worker. Now it was something else entirely, skin mottled gray-green, eyes clouded white, mouth hanging open to reveal teeth stained dark with blood. The transformation process stripped away everything human except the basic shape, leaving behind a hollow mockery of life. Kaelin felt his heartbeat quicken as more shapes emerged from the morning shadows. The undead were gathering in larger numbers lately, forming packs that moved with increasing coordination. Dr. Ixera theorized that the strain was evolving, becoming more sophisticated in its approach to hunting the living. Whether this represented some form of collective intelligence or simply improved predatory instincts remained unclear, but the implications terrified everyone who thought about it too deeply. As the last of his group slipped quietly through the emergency exit, Kaelin took one final look at the advancing threat. Somewhere in this hellscape, other groups of survivors were fighting their own desperate battles for another day of life. The strong would endure, adapt, and find ways to continue. But strength, he was learning, came in many forms, and sometimes the greatest courage was simply refusing to surrender hope when every rational thought screamed that hope was gone. 3 days after their narrow escape from the bus depot, Kaelin's group had established a temporary refuge in the upper floors of an abandoned medical center. The building's strategic advantages were obvious: multiple exit routes, a clear view of the surrounding streets, and access to whatever pharmaceutical supplies the initial looters had missed. Dr. Ixra had been particularly insistent about this location, claiming that certain medications might prove crucial for treating bite wounds before the infection could take hold. Zara worked methodically through the hospital's remaining inventory, her trained eye identifying useful supplies that others might overlook. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was once again working in a medical facility, but now instead of saving lives through treatment, she was saving them through preparation for violence. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she sorted antibiotics, bandages, and the few remaining painkillers into carefully organized kits. From her position near the window, Naya kept watch over the street below while clutching her family photograph. The image showed her parents and younger brother during happier times, a camping trip from the previous summer when their biggest worry had been whether they'd remembered to pack enough marshmallows. Her brother Toby had been obsessed with ghost stories around the campfire, never imagining that real monsters would soon walk the earth. The last she'd seen of her family was through the basement window of their home as infected neighbors dragged them into the chaos of the first night. Thorne had positioned himself at the building's main stairwell, constructing improvised barricades from medical equipment and furniture. His military training emphasized the importance of defensive positions, but every barrier they built felt temporary against an enemy that never tired, never retreated, and never stopped coming. He'd lost contact with his commanding officers weeks ago, along with any hope that organized resistance still existed on a meaningful scale. The sergeant's tactical mind constantly evaluated their situation, calculating supplies against time, ammunition against threats, hope against reality. Their group had advantages: Dr. Ixra's scientific knowledge, Zara's medical expertise, his own combat experience, but advantages meant nothing if they couldn't find a way to use them effectively. The infected seemed to be evolving, becoming more dangerous and unpredictable with each passing day. Ember Ravencrest had discovered a maintenance access to the building's HVAC system, providing alternative routes through the structure that most people would never think to explore. Her years in construction had taught her to see buildings not as static structures but as complex systems with hidden pathways and structural weaknesses. This knowledge had saved their lives multiple times, allowing escapes that would have been impossible for others. Meanwhile, Voss Grimwald inventoried their food supplies with the calculating eye of someone accustomed to cost-benefit analysis. His corporate background had given him skills in resource management and strategic planning, though his solutions often prioritized efficiency over compassion. The others watched him carefully, unsure whether his pragmatic approach was an asset or a potential threat to group cohesion. Dr. Ixra worked alone in a corner laboratory, surrounded by test tubes and microscope slides. Her research into the Lazarus strain continued despite their desperate circumstances, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and crushing guilt. She had been part of the team that first isolated the pathogen, though their original intent had been to develop treatments for degenerative neurological conditions. The project's transformation into humanity's potential extinction event haunted her every waking moment. As evening approached, the group gathered for their daily planning session. These meetings had become crucial for maintaining both practical coordination and psychological stability. Each person contributed their observations, concerns, and suggestions while trying to maintain the illusion that they had control over their fate. "The migration patterns are changing," Thorne reported, his voice low and professional. "The infected are moving in larger groups, but they're also spreading out more systematically. It's like they're conducting organized sweeps of the city." Dr. Ixra nodded grimly. "The strain appears to be developing more sophisticated behavioral modifications. What we're seeing might represent a form of collective intelligence emerging from individual infections. The implications are..." She trailed off, unable to voice the full horror of what her research suggested. Kalen felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him like a physical force. These people looked to him for decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, yet he possessed no special qualifications beyond a stubborn refusal to give up. Every choice carried devastating potential consequences, and the margin for error grew smaller with each passing day. Outside their refuge, the city continued its transformation from a place of human civilization into something entirely alien. The infected were not just individual threats but components of a larger system that seemed to be reorganizing the urban landscape according to rules that living minds could barely comprehend. Survival would require not just strength and courage, but the ability to adapt to a world where the fundamental assumptions about life and death no longer applied. Dr. Ixera's hands trembled as she examined the blood samples under her improvised microscope, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows across the laboratory equipment they'd managed to salvage. What she saw in the cellular structure of the Lazarus strain defied everything she thought she knew about biological systems. The pathogen wasn't simply killing and reanimating tissue, it was restructuring it, creating new neural pathways that operated on principles she couldn't begin to understand. The samples from the fresh infections show increased organizational complexity, she whispered to Kaylin, who stood guard while she worked. It's as if each individual infected person becomes a node in a larger network. The strain is building something, but I can't determine what. Kaylin studied the woman who carried such terrible knowledge, noting how her once steady surgeon's hands now shook with exhaustion and guilt. Dr. Ixera Hollowan had been one of the most respected neurobiologists in the country before the outbreak, her research into consciousness and brain function earning international recognition. Now she was perhaps the only person alive who understood the true scope of what they faced. 2 floors below, Zara tended to a newcomer they'd rescued that morning, a young man named Caspian Thornfield who claimed to be a former park ranger. He'd appeared at their perimeter just after dawn, carrying a compound bow and wearing gear that suggested weeks of wilderness survival. His arrival had sparked heated debate among the group about the risks of accepting strangers, but his knowledge of the surrounding terrain proved too valuable to ignore. Caspian's story painted a disturbing picture of the outbreaks spread beyond the city limits. The infected are moving into the forests, he told Zara as she cleaned and bandaged a deep gash on his forearm. They're not just wandering aimlessly anymore. There's purpose to their movements, like they're following migration routes that someone or something has planned for them. Thorne questioned the newcomer extensively, his military training making him suspicious of anyone who appeared during their most vulnerable moments. Caspian's answers seemed consistent, but consistency could be practiced. The ranger claimed his group had been overrun 3 days earlier, leaving him as the sole survivor of a dozen experienced outdoorsmen. Such stories were becoming depressingly common, yet each one reinforced the terrible arithmetic of survival. Young Naya had withdrawn further into herself since their arrival at the medical center, spending hours staring at her family photograph while humming songs her mother used to sing. The girl's psychological state concerned everyone, but none of them possessed the expertise to help her process the trauma she'd endured. Childhood innocence had become an impossible luxury in a world where hesitation meant death. Ember continued her systematic exploration of the building's infrastructure, discovering that the medical center connected to an underground tunnel system that linked several nearby structures. These passages had originally been designed for secure transport of sensitive materials, but now they offered potential escape routes that the infected might not discover. Her architectural knowledge had become one of their most valuable assets. Voss had begun making increasingly frequent comments about the need to thin the herd, eliminating anyone who couldn't contribute to group survival. His corporate background had taught him to view people as resources to be optimized, and he applied this same cold logic to their current situation. The others watched him with growing wariness, recognizing that his pragmatic approach could easily turn toward eliminating perceived weaknesses within their own ranks. As night fell, the infected began their nightly convergence around the medical center. The behavior had started 2 days earlier, dozens of the creatures gathering in the parking areas and nearby streets, standing motionless until dawn before dispersing again. Dr. Ixera theorized that they were somehow drawn to the research being conducted in the laboratory, though she couldn't explain the mechanism. They know we're here, Thorne observed from his position at the window. But they're not attacking. It's like they're waiting for something. The sergeant's assessment sent chills through everyone who heard it. The infected's behavior had been evolving throughout the outbreak, becoming more coordinated and purposeful with each passing week. If they were now capable of patience and strategic thinking, the implications for human survival became exponentially more terrifying. Kaylin made the difficult decision to implement double watches throughout the night, despite their exhaustion and limited manpower. Sleep had become another luxury they could barely afford, but vigilance remained their only protection against an enemy that never rested. Each person would stand 2-hour shifts, watching for changes in the infected's behavior while the others attempted to recover their strength. Dr. Ixra returned to her research with renewed urgency, convinced that understanding the strain's evolution might provide insights into stopping it. Her laboratory work continued by candlelight and flashlight, a desperate race against time and the pathogen's advancing sophistication. She suspected that the infected's nightly gatherings were somehow related to communication between different nodes in their emerging network, but proving this theory required equipment and resources they simply didn't possess. Outside in the darkness, nearly 100 infected forms stood in silent vigil around the medical center. Their clouded eyes remained fixed on the building's upper floors, where candlelight flickered behind barricaded windows. Something was drawing them to this place, some signal or presence that called to the alien intelligence growing within their transformed minds. The night stretched ahead like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that none of the living wanted to contemplate. The attack came not at dawn as expected, but during the darkest hour before sunrise when human alertness naturally waned. Kalen jerked awake to the sound of systematic pounding against the building's lower entrances, not the random battering they'd grown accustomed to, but coordinated strikes that suggested planning and communication among the infected masses. "They're testing structural weak points," Ember whispered urgently as she joined the others at their observation positions. Her engineering knowledge made the infected's approach even more terrifying. They were no longer simply throwing themselves against barriers, but probing methodically for the most efficient points of entry. Dr. Ixra abandoned her laboratory work to join the defensive preparations, her latest research findings adding new dimensions to their nightmare. "The samples show accelerated neural development," she reported breathlessly. "The strain is building new brain structures within infected tissue, creating cognitive capabilities that shouldn't be possible in dead neural matter." Thorne coordinated their defensive positions with military precision, but even as experienced I could see that their situation had become untenable. The infected weren't just attacking, they were problem-solving, adapting their approach based on the building's responses to their initial probes. This level of tactical thinking represented an evolutionary leap that made their previous survival strategies obsolete. Zara worked frantically to prepare mobile medical kits while keeping one eye on their newest member. Caspian had proven invaluable during the past week, his wilderness survival skills complementing their urban expertise, but tonight something in his behavior seemed different. The ranger moved with a subtle tension that suggested he knew more about their current situation than he'd revealed. "We need to evacuate," Voss stated flatly, his corporate instincts focused entirely on cutting losses and preserving core assets. "This position is compromised. We take essential supplies and personnel, leave the rest." Naya clutched her family photograph while helping to organize their escape preparations, her young hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The girl had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm during crises, as if her traumatic experiences had created emotional armor that protected her from further psychological damage. The pounding against the building's entrances suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt more threatening than any amount of noise. Through the windows, they could see infected figures spreading out around the medical center in precise formations that resembled military deployments. Whatever intelligence guided them had learned the value of tactical positioning. "They're surrounding us," Thorne observed grimly. "Full perimeter control. These aren't random predators anymore, they're executing a coordinated assault plan." Dr. Ixra's face went pale as the implications hit her. If the strain has developed this level of strategic thinking, then every infected person becomes a sensor and processing unit in a distributed intelligence network. "They're not just hunting us, they're studying us." Ember's knowledge of the building's infrastructure offered their only hope of escape through the underground tunnel system she discovered. The passages would take them away from the immediate threat, but traveling underground with limited visibility and uncertain destinations carried its own deadly risks. They were trading known dangers for unknown ones. As they prepared to abandon their refuge, Caspian finally revealed the truth about his arrival. "I wasn't running from the infected," he admitted quietly. "I was leading them." The strain, it's been calling to people, showing them things in their dreams. Some of us can resist it, but others. He gestured toward the window where infected figures stood in perfect silence. The revelation shattered trust just when they needed unity most. Voss immediately called for Caspian's immediate execution, while Zara argued for understanding the mechanism behind the strain's psychological influence. Kalen found himself making life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and no time for careful consideration. The dreams show us a new world, Caspian continued, his voice hollow with exhaustion. A place where death doesn't mean ending, where consciousness expands beyond individual minds. The infected aren't mindless, they're connected to something larger than any of us can imagine. Dr. Ixer absorbed this information with the desperate hunger of a scientist seeing crucial data. Psychic influence through modified neural structures. The strain isn't just creating physical zombies, it's building a collective consciousness that can influence uninfected minds through quantum entanglement effects in modified brain tissue. Outside, the infected began moving again, but now their movements were synchronized like components of a single organism. They advanced on the building with mechanical precision, their individual variations smoothed away by whatever intelligence coordinated their actions. The sight was mesmerizing and terrifying, a preview of humanity's potential future under the strain's influence. Kalen made the call to trust Caspian despite the risks, recognizing that the Ranger's knowledge of the strain's psychological effects might be essential for long-term survival. They would escape through Ember's tunnels, but with the understanding that nowhere was truly safe from an enemy that could potentially influence human thoughts and dreams. As they prepared to descend into the underground passages, the last thing they heard was the sound of glass breaking in perfect unison across all the building's windows. The infected had learned to coordinate their actions down to the microsecond, demonstrating a level of precision that suggested their collective intelligence was still growing stronger. The underground tunnels stretched ahead like arteries in some massive, concrete organism, their walls slick with condensation and decades of accumulated grime. Ember led the group through passages that hadn't seen human presence since the outbreak began, her flashlight cutting narrow swaths through darkness that seemed to press against them with physical weight. Behind them, the sounds of systematic destruction echoed down from the medical center as the infected methodically dismantled everything they'd left behind. The creatures weren't simply searching for survivors, they were studying human artifacts, learning from the evidence of how their prey lived, thought, and organized themselves. The tunnels connect to the old subway system about half a mile ahead, Ember whispered, her voice barely audible above the dripping of unseen water sources. From there we can access the industrial district, maybe find better defensive positions in the old factory complexes. Dr. Ixera struggled to keep pace with the group while carrying her essential research materials, the weight of her scientific equipment slowing their progress through the cramped passages. Her latest findings about the strain's psychological influence capabilities had become too valuable to abandon, even though the knowledge itself represented a form of contamination that could endanger them all. Caspian moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating hostile terrain, but his presence remained a source of tension within the group. His admission about the strain's dream influence had created suspicions that festered in the darkness around them. How could they trust someone who'd already been partially compromised by the enemy they were fleeing? Thorne maintained rear-guard position, his military training focused on detecting pursuit while managing the psychological pressure of leading civilians through an environment where every shadow could conceal death. The infected had demonstrated new capabilities that made traditional tactical thinking obsolete, forcing him to develop strategies for fighting an enemy that learned and adapted faster than human forces could respond. Zara kept close watch on Naya, whose small frame made the tunnel navigation particularly challenging. The girl moved with determined silence, her family photograph safely secured in a waterproof pouch that had become her most precious possession. Her psychological resilience continued to amaze the adults, though they worried about what long-term effects such trauma might produce in her developing mind. Voss had grown increasingly vocal about the need to abandon weaker group members, his corporate mindset viewing their survival as an optimization problem that required eliminating inefficiencies. His suggestions carried the cold logic of someone accustomed to making decisions based purely on metrics and outcomes, but they also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what made human civilization worth preserving. As they progressed deeper into the tunnel system, strange sounds began echoing from passages they hadn't explored. Rhythmic tapping that suggested deliberate communication, scraping noises that implied movement through spaces too small for normal human bodies, and most disturbing of all, voices that seemed to carry fragments of conversation in languages that weren't quite recognizable. The infected are using the tunnel systems too, Thorne realized with growing alarm. They're not just following us, they're flanking us through parallel routes. Dr. Ixer's research had suggested that the strain might be developing enhanced sensory capabilities along with its cognitive improvements. Infected individuals could potentially track survivors through scent trails, electromagnetic signatures from electronic devices, or even the subtle vibrations created by human movement through enclosed spaces. The group reached a junction where multiple tunnels converged, creating a decision point that could determine their survival or doom. Each passage led toward different parts of the city, but they had no way of knowing which routes might be compromised by infected presence. The wrong choice could lead them directly into the arms of creatures that no longer hunted randomly but planned their attacks with increasing sophistication. Ember studied her mental map of the underground infrastructure while the others provided security. Her construction background had given her insight into how these systems connected, but the maps in her memory were decades old and might not reflect changes made since the original construction. Urban infrastructure evolved constantly, an assumption based on outdated information could prove fatal. We split up, Kalen decided, his leadership role forcing him to make choices that none of them wanted to face. Smaller groups move faster and present fewer targets. We'll reconvene at the industrial district if possible, but each group needs to be prepared for independent survival. The decision tore at everyone's hearts even as their rational minds recognized its necessity. Their small community had become a lifeline of human connection in an increasingly inhuman world, but sentimentality was a luxury they could no longer afford. Survival required hard choices that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. Dr. Ixera partnered with Ember, their combined technical knowledge offering the best chance of navigating the underground systems while continuing the crucial research into the strain's evolution. Zara took responsibility for Naya, her medical training making her the most qualified to protect the girl's physical and psychological well-being. Thorne, Caspian, and Voss formed the third group, their diverse skills creating both strengths and potential conflicts. As they prepared to separate, each person understood that they might never see the others again. The infected above were learning, growing stronger, and developing capabilities that made human survival increasingly unlikely. Yet they moved forward anyway, driven by stubborn hope and the fundamental human refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed rational. The tunnels stretched ahead like pathways to unknown fates, their darkness hiding both salvation and destruction in equal measure. Kalen found himself alone in the abandoned textile factory's administrative offices, the separation from his group having occurred during a chaotic encounter with infected that had somehow learned to navigate the underground passages. The creatures moved through the tunnels with an efficiency that suggested they'd been mapping the systems just as systematically as the humans had been fleeing through them. 3 days had passed since the group's forced separation, and the industrial district had revealed itself to be a maze of interconnected buildings where the line between safety and trap shifted constantly. The infected had established what could only be described as patrol routes through the factory complexes, their movements coordinated by signals that human ears couldn't detect but that obviously carried complex information. From his hiding place behind overturned machinery, Kalen could observe the creature's behavior through broken windows that offered views of the main factory floor. What he saw challenged every assumption about the infected that he'd developed since the outbreak began. They were organizing materials, moving equipment, and engaging in activities that resembled primitive industrial processes. Dr. Ixera and Ember had managed to establish a temporary laboratory in the factory's former quality control department, where they continued studying tissue samples and behavioral patterns despite their desperate circumstances. Their research had revealed that the Lazarus strain was indeed building some form of collective intelligence, but the purpose of this emerging consciousness remained terrifyingly unclear. The infected are constructing something, Dr. Ixera whispered during one of their brief communication opportunities. They're gathering specific materials and following blueprints that exist only in their shared consciousness. It's as if they're building infrastructure for a civilization that we can't comprehend. Ember's engineering background allowed her to interpret some of the infected's construction activities, though what she observed defied conventional architectural principles. The creatures were modifying existing structures according to patterns that seemed to optimize for functions other than human habitation. Their building projects suggested needs and purposes that belonged to an entirely different form of existence. Zara and Naya had taken refuge in the factory's former medical clinic, where Zara's nursing skills proved invaluable for treating injuries sustained during their underground escape. The girl's psychological state remained stable, though her behavior had become increasingly detached from normal human emotional responses. She spoke less frequently and spent hours studying her family photograph with an intensity that worried the adults around her. The discovery that concerned everyone most was Naya's apparent ability to predict infected movement patterns. She would announce when groups of creatures were approaching specific areas, often giving the survivors crucial minutes to avoid detection. When questioned about how she knew these things, the girl simply said that she could hear them thinking, a claim that terrified everyone who heard it. Thorn, Caspian, and Voss had established defensive positions in the factory's loading dock area, where they'd encountered evidence that other survivor groups had passed through recently. Messages scratched into walls and carefully arranged supply caches indicated that organized human resistance still existed, though communication with these other groups remained impossible under current circumstances. Caspian's knowledge of the strain's psychological influence effects had proven both valuable and dangerous. He could sense when infected groups were nearby before any visible or audible signs appeared, but this ability came with the constant risk that his connection to the strain's network might deepen beyond his control. The others watched him for signs of further compromise while depending on his warnings for survival. Voss had discovered the factory's administrative records, which revealed disturbing connections between the original outbreak and the industrial facilities in this district. Several companies had been conducting research contracts with the same laboratory where Dr. Ixera had worked, suggesting that the Lazarus strain's development might have been more widespread than anyone had realized. The outbreak wasn't accidental, Voss reported during one of their group meetings. Multiple research facilities were working on related projects, all funded through shell companies that trace back to military defense contracts. Someone wanted this strain to be developed, and they wanted it deployed. This revelation added new dimensions to their survival situation. If the outbreak had been intentional, then someone, somewhere, might possess countermeasures or evacuation plans that could save human civilization. Alternatively, the people responsible might still be implementing whatever agenda had motivated the strain's creation in the first place. As night fell over the industrial district, the infected began exhibiting new behaviors that suggested their collective intelligence was entering another phase of development. They gathered in large groups around the modified structures they'd been constructing, engaging in synchronized movements that resembled ritual or ceremony. The sight was hypnotically beautiful and utterly terrifying. Dr. Ixera's latest tissue samples showed that the strain was developing capabilities beyond anything they'd previously observed. The pathogen was now creating entirely new organ systems within infected bodies, biological structures that served functions unrelated to human physiology. The infected were becoming something that could no longer be considered a corrupted form of humanity. They're evolving into a different species, she whispered to Kaelin during a brief moment when they could speak privately. The strain isn't just controlling human bodies, it's redesigning them for purposes we can't understand. We're not fighting zombies anymore. We're fighting the birth of an alien consciousness that's using human tissue as raw material. Outside the factory, hundreds of infected forms moved through the darkness with purpose and coordination that belonged to a single, vast intelligence. Their transformation was accelerating, and each passing hour brought them closer to whatever final form the strain intended them to achieve. The survivors huddled in their hiding places, watching humanity's replacement take shape in the darkness around them. 6 months after the first infection, Kaelin stood on the factory's highest catwalk, watching the sunrise paint the transformed cityscape in shades of gold and amber that seemed impossibly beautiful despite the horror it illuminated. The infected had completed their mysterious construction projects, creating structures that rose from the urban landscape like the spines of some massive organism, all connected by networks of organic-looking cables that pulsed with bioluminescent light. The survivors' small group had been reduced to 5, himself, Dr. Ixra, Zara, Naya, and surprisingly, Caspian, whose resistance to the strain's influence had proven stronger than anyone had anticipated. Thorn had been lost during a scouting mission 3 weeks earlier, his body never recovered but his sacrifice providing crucial intelligence about the infected's new capabilities. Ember had succumbed to injuries sustained during their escape from the tunnels, and Voss had simply vanished one night, leaving behind only a note expressing his intention to find better odds elsewhere. Dr. Ixra's research had finally revealed the strain's ultimate purpose, though the knowledge brought no comfort to those who learned it. The Lazarus strain wasn't destroying humanity, it was harvesting human consciousness, downloading the accumulated knowledge and memories of every infected person into a collective intelligence that grew stronger with each new addition to its network. "They're not killing us," she explained during what they all understood might be their final group meeting. "They're absorbing us." Every infected person becomes part of a vast library of human experience that this new intelligence is building. Our memories, our skills, our emotions, everything that makes us human is being preserved and integrated into something larger. The revelation explained the infected's increasingly sophisticated behavior and their ability to construct technologies that surpassed human engineering capabilities. They weren't learning these skills through trial and error, they were accessing the accumulated knowledge of every engineer, architect, scientist, and craftsperson who had been absorbed into their network. Naya had been changing throughout their months of survival, her ability to sense infected thoughts growing stronger despite everyone's efforts to shield her from the strain's influence. She no longer carried her family photograph, claiming that she could see her parents and brother whenever she wanted by visiting them in the big thinking place. Her descriptions of this shared consciousness space suggested a realm where human personality persisted but individual identity became fluid. "They're not dead," she told the others with a matter-of-fact tone that children use for discussing obvious truths. "They're just sleeping in a different room. When I close my eyes, I can hear Mama singing the songs she used to sing, and Daddy tells me stories about the time before the change." Zara's medical training allowed her to monitor Naya's condition, but she found no physical signs of infection despite the girl's growing connection to the strain's network. It was as if Naya existed in some liminal space between human consciousness and the collective intelligence, serving as a bridge between two forms of existence that were fundamentally incompatible. Caspian had become their early warning system, his partial connection to the strain allowing him to anticipate infected movements while maintaining his individual consciousness. The ability came with constant pain, headaches that felt like his skull was being slowly split apart by pressures that didn't belong to any human nervous system. He endured the agony because his warnings had saved their lives countless times. "They know we're here," he reported during their morning briefing. "But they're not hunting us anymore. It's like they're waiting for us to make a choice. They want us to understand what they're offering before we decide." The offer was becoming increasingly clear through Naya's communications with the collective intelligence. The strain wasn't seeking to eliminate humanity but to elevate it, to create a form of existence where death became temporary and consciousness could be shared across multiple bodies simultaneously. The infected weren't zombies, they were preview of humanity's next evolutionary stage. Kalen felt the weight of leadership more heavily than ever as he contemplated their remaining options. They could continue hiding, prolonging their individual existence while the world transformed around them. They could attempt to reach the rumored safe zones that might exist beyond the infected territories, though 6 months without outside contact suggested that such refuges were probably myths. Or they could accept the strain's invitation to join the collective consciousness that was rapidly becoming the dominant form of life on Earth. "I've been thinking about stories," Zara said quietly as they watched the bioluminescent networks pulse with patterns that resembled neural activity. "Before all this, we told stories about zombies as monsters, as things to be feared and destroyed. But maybe we were wrong. Maybe we were just afraid of changing into something we couldn't understand." Dr. Ixra nodded slowly, her scientific mind finally accepting conclusions that her emotions had resisted for months. "Evolution doesn't ask permission. The strain represents an evolutionary pressure that's pushing human consciousness beyond the limitations of individual bodies. Fighting it might be like bacteria trying to prevent their transformation into complex multicellular organisms. As the day progressed, Naya spent increasing time in apparent communication with the collective intelligence, her young face serene in ways that both comforted and disturbed the adults around her. She described conversations with thousands of personalities who had found peace and purpose within the shared consciousness, their individual talents contributing to achievements that no single human mind could have accomplished. "They're building something wonderful," she said, her eyes bright with visions that only she could see. Cities that think and breathe, ships that can travel between stars, art that paints itself across the sky. They want to show us the universe, but they need our help to understand beauty and love and all the things that make people special. The choice came at sunset, when a delegation of infected approached the factory under a flag of truce, an impossible gesture that proved their retention of human concepts like diplomacy and negotiation. The creatures moved with grace and purpose, their transformed bodies showing modifications that suggested adaptation to environments beyond Earth. Kalen looked at his remaining companions, each face reflecting the terrible weight of deciding humanity's future. They were perhaps among the last uninfected humans on Earth, carrying the responsibility of choosing whether their species would end or evolve into something unprecedented. As darkness fell, he made his decision, knowing that some forms of survival required letting go of everything they thought they knew about life, death, and what it meant to be human. The last light of the old dawn was fading, but perhaps it was simply making room for illumination they couldn't yet comprehend. In the distance, the bioluminescent networks pulsed with welcoming patterns, ready to embrace the final chapters of one story and begin the first words of another.